All right, on the phone with me right now, one of the creative forces behind the hit series Dark Side of the Ring, Vice TV's top rated program, along with his partner, Jason Eisner. They created this concept that has been widely imitated but never duplicated. And the new season starts on Tuesday, March 25th on Vice TV. And he's back again to talk about the new lineup, Evan Husney. Evan, good to have you back.
Hey, thanks, Jim. It's another year, another season, another podcast with you. Very happy to be back. Thanks so much.
Some more dark stories with light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
On a few of these.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been talking about the lineup, but we want to get from the horse's mouth. I'm sorry, Evan. No, you since you got your teeth fixed, that's no longer a problem. But we want to get direct from the source because, for example, I don't know if these are in order or not. As you can hear, I have my sheet with me.
Mm-hmm.
But when we were talking about this, I was talking with Brian on a recent show, and the Hell in a Cell episode came up. And obviously, the Hell in a Cell, Mankind and Undertaker.
Right.
And I was trying to explain because he said, well, how can this be covered differently, than what's already been covered? And I was trying to explain, but you probably can better that this comes from trying to look inside the bizarre mind of our friend Mick, mankind's mind. Say it better.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, one of the I guess from the beginning of this show, we worked with Mick Foley on our pilot episode, the Killing of Bruiser Brody episode. And I've always been fascinated by Mick. I mean, his sort of approach to wrestling, his craft, his philosophy that he brings to his style of performance is very unique. Obviously he's very committed to all the characters he plays, but he also subscribes to that sort of theater of pain style of performance art, if you will. That's that self-harm, self-sacrifice type of performance. And to me, it's always been fascinating anytime to hear him talk about, just how he sees that approach and his philosophy to that approach and how he got himself over with that. I mean, obviously it's brutal to watch and, you sympathize with him and what he's dealing with now. But for him, it was a way to connect with the audience. He sort of felt like it might have been difficult for him to connect in a different way. And this was his way to get that reaction from people, like that they had never seen, somebody take a flat back on the concrete or, some other brutal thing that he does to himself, hard way stuff or whatever it is. That was his way to connect. And for him, it's this very deep sort of need to not acceptance, but, he always wants to make sure, the audience is getting their money's worth, and that he needs that love, from the audience. And this was, I think, from a very young age, something that he saw the power of having a kind of gross out, wild, weird sort of reaction out of people. And I think that's what his talents are, to do this. And so for me, it's like to look at it or to use the Hell in the Cell match as sort of a microcosm of, his approach to wrestling, I think made a lot of sense because it is the quintessential moment for Mick in a lot of ways. I mean, for people my generation, when I saw that live on pay-per-view as it was happening, I had never seen anything like that before because
join the club.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, but it as an impressionable viewer, it transcended the idea of like a wrestling storyline, because now you have concern over the individual. This whole thing is this must be real because it's not like, a part of the quote unquote script or whatever. And there's this like intense immediacy to it. And it was an incredible, indelible experience for me watching it. And I know a lot of people had the same reaction. And so to me, that's sort of like the perfect canvas, for him, for lack of a better term, to kind of craft, everything he had been trying to craft up until that point.
Well, that's the thing with Mick. And, I've told a story. I was there that night and astonished at what he put himself through. And we've told that story a bunch, but a lot of people, before I get to my main point, I'll say that the one thing that Mick had over everybody else that tries to do the same thing is that he still had the talent to somehow make it look uncooperative.
Right.
He didn't want to go along with this. He was, flung into it. But that's what got Mick over, got him noticed, got the attention. And I think I told you this one time we were speaking about him, is that after a couple of years and performances like this and some of the other things that he did during that, onset of the Attitude Era, at one point when he became Dude Love, because that story came up from his another face of Foley from his, teenage years, Dude Love, the guy that dove off the roof. He felt like he was shortchanging the fans because
right.
Dude Love was not the guy that took the big bumps or had the wild, bloody matches. He was the gimmick. But at that point, I had to tell him, I said, the reason why I think that the fans loved Mick on a personal basis is because he had that unique personality they could identify with him.
100%.
And at first, the bumps got him noticed and the punishment got him noticed. But then as they started to like him more and more as a person rather than as an athlete or a celebrity or whatever, it made him uncomfortable. Yep. Instead of going, wow, they go like, oh, no, Mick, please. They felt like somebody was hurting their friend. And
right. Yep.
I think that's when he realized that it was the tail end of his career that he could back up on that stuff and just be Mick, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. And obviously there is a darker side, if you will, to that, to the stuff he was doing in this time period. For example, obviously the effect it would have on his body, now, flashing forward to now and what he's going through, but also like what the episode gets into is his family. I mean, his wife, who he, they met very young, and she sort of understood his philosophy and what he was trying, these moments he was trying to make, through wrestling and his plight, of wanting to be this very hardcore, believable wrestler. But then, of course, as you have a family and there's this escalating need to outdo yourself.
Yeah.
And this the snowball effect, it has a, you have children now, mouths to feed, and you have a family, and they're kind of now tagging along on this ride, and that's difficult. And I think our episode definitely gets into the family side of having, a husband, a father like Mick, with, kind of wrestling with, the things that he wants to do and to achieve, but also at what risk, and so I think that's definitely part of it. But also it's scary in terms of what he has to live with now, in terms of what he's going through cognitively and the unknown of what's going to happen in 10 years from now, 15 years from now. And this sort of, it's for him, it's a mixed blessing, this match, because it's something that sort of made him the legend that he wanted to always become. But it also is something that he very narrowly escaped, some even worse consequences than he did, so. Yeah.
And who else is on this episode? I know I gave you some comments. I may end up on the cutting room floor, but
right.
You got some other interesting people.
Yeah. I think with this episode, we really wanted to try and live in the match as much as possible. So I think the amount of time we spend talking about the moment to moment in the match is actually longer than the match it is in actuality, which is always fun. I think that's very fun to watch. So we wanted to get a lot of people that were, there and covering it or involved in it in some way. So, so we got Gerald Briscoe in it, who's watching the monitors,
right,
and producing there. And from his perspective, we did get Dr. Francois Petit, who makes a run in the episode, who's an incredible character. And he's awesome.
Is it Mick, his body is like a whale. It is just, he has no bone structure. You can just move him around.
Yeah, right. Let me fix you, baby. But he's He's great, and he gives a great perspective in terms of, calling Mick like, his greatest patient in many ways of the types of stuff he's had to do to reset him and, throughout the years. But it's cool to hear from him. I mean, I had no idea he was Sub-Zero in the Mortal Kombat movie. I did not know that.
I didn't either.
I did not know that.
I thought he was just the guy that did handstands on the boys' backs.
No, he's in the movie. And so he gives a very unique, perspective. Of course, Mick's family is in there, his wife, Colette, Noelle, his daughter, and Mickey, his son. Jimmy Corderas is in the episode as well. Al Snow, who sort of took care of Mick that night, trying to get him, giving him all the help he could get to get into bed and all that stuff. It's pretty brutal. Jim Ross returns for it, of course, on color commentary, yourself. And yeah, I think that's everybody.
Is that the season premiere? I don't know if my list is in order.
Yes.
That is. So on March 25th, we're going to take the ride on the Hell in a Cell train.
Yes.
But following that, another episode that I shot some comments for and that I was peripherally involved in the man's career. That was his only run where he wasn't as successful as he was everywhere else. Vader gets an episode this season.
That's right. Yeah, very excited about that. Just one of my favorites, again, from childhood in terms of that, super heavyweight, big man, strong man character. Always a huge fan of his stuff in Japan with that crazy mask, with the steam coming out of it. Yeah. Incredible. It's incredible stuff. So, yeah, this episode is, again, very family-based as well. His ex-wife is in there, his son, and they're tremendous in the episode. The story covers a lot of the development of, his incredibly stiff strongman style, and also contrasting his very emotional volatility at times. He sort of had that. He had that, and how he broke into the business. I think he broke in with Brody and Stan in the same locker room, and they sort of kind of beat the shit out of him and kind of showed him what it was all about. Obviously he comes from the Hard Knocks football background, of course, too. But you can see the development of that and how he came in, and then, he was chosen for that big Van Vader gimmick in Japan, and so the sort of, the creation of that, monster character. As I said, it dives into the dichotomy, of his intense performance and his intense physicality, and just somebody who really had a very sensitive and volatile inner side. It gets into
he could swing from a wrecking ball to a teddy bear in like the twinkling of an eye, right?
Yes, and I think one moment that really illustrates that is the incident that occurred with Joe Thurman. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, the power bomb gone somewhat awry.
Yeah. So Joe's in the episode, which is interesting, and I don't think he's really ever talked much about that incident. But he describes basically, Vader. I don't know, a switch went off, and he saw red and just became this vicious monster when the bell rang, and then following what was pretty much like a temporary paralysis moment that, what happened to Joe after you see that, the moves he took and how kind of careless Vader was in the ring with him, that he instantly was just like an emotional wreck after that, Vader was, in terms of what he had done to somebody else, so that is kind of part of his, emotional makeup, if you will,
and part of it, I've talked about, the biggest comment I always have is Vince never got Leon.
Yes.
Vince never got Leon, and Leon didn't get Vince.
Mm-hmm.
And, part of it may have been because, other pro football players have made the successful transition,
right?
Whether they played for just a few years or a number of years in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
But Leon just always had that football mentality of, here's how I should be treated, and here's that blah, 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 and standing up. And I guess they have a union over there in football. And it worked for him when he was taking care of himself in the Wild West, like Brody did in Japan or, in Mexico or whatever. But when he got into the Vince environment, Leon hadn't been a lifelong wrestling fan, got into business late. Vince saw a whole different person. He had never seen the Vader that everybody else in the world knew because he wasn't watching.
Right.
And it didn't connect. That was and I get the opportunity to manage Vader, the only place that he ever wrestled in his after his rookie year where he wasn't the world champion. But go on, Evan.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, you mentioned in the episode about how Vince didn't have much of a frame of reference for him. And so it was kind of this idea, you know, I mean, you have to know how to position somebody like that, you know, when you're given a monster heel like that, a one of a kind one, especially. And it seemed like it never really connected. Obviously, he was pretty banged up at that time, too, I think. And so he was slowing down a bit, and his weight was getting heavier. And, you know, JR talks about this.
The weight clause.
The weight clause, right. And JR's kind of response.
Steen in Ring of Honor was pissed off. I said, just lose 40 pounds for your health and performance sake, right? I said, do we have to put a weight clause in your contract? He's like, what the fuck? I said, hey, if Vince can do it to Vader, we can do it to you.
Right. Yeah. And you kind of get a peek into just the talent management side of things, you know, through JR, who kind of has to deal with trying to get Vader, you know, healthier. And I think he enrolled Vader and Yokozuna into this kind of university program that had a weight loss.
Duke.
Duke, right.
They didn't go at the same time because I was monitoring Yoko when he was there. I've told that story, but I want to say, I don't know that Leon ever actually went. I think they wanted to. I don't know. Now, JR may have a firmer memory, but I think they wanted him to, and somehow he avoided it, but he might have gone. There was talk of it.
Yeah, I think JR mentioned, maybe he's conflating the stories or whatnot, but he was mentioning how, like, you know, he found out, I wasn't sure if this was Yoko or Vader, both, whatever, that, you know, he found out that somebody was smuggling in fried chicken.
That was Yoko.
Got it, right. Yeah,
that was Yoko. He had actually... that was the joke in the office. We sent Yokozuna to the Duke weight loss clinic and he ate it.
Right.
But anyway, back to Leon, though. Yeah. That's another episode this season. And you know, again, I've mentioned this before, but I love the subjects that you guys have the opportunity to cover now that the first couple of seasons, well, we got to have the big names, right? Because you're proving yourself. But now that you got the track record and you blow all the competition away, you can go into some of the things. Because when has Vader ever really been featured? Any Vader footage or whatever by any of the WWE authorized programming? And you know, a lot of your guys fit or your episodes, I should say, fit that picture, including the next episode on a guy who the WWE has definitely featured him in the past, but he had a career outside that for a long period of time and a few interesting stories. Mr. USA, Tony Atlas.
Yes. Yep.
And now Tony's still alive and kicking and around with us. So the story isn't all that dark and gloomy, but he's gone through some shit in his career, to say the least.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, you know, Tony says, you know, Hogan had told him once that, you know, he's one of the only wrestlers he had seen that had worked his way from the top to the bottom, you know. That is,
I don't know. I've known a few of those also.
I'm sure there's a few others. Yeah. But he, you know, that is kind of his story. I mean, you know, Tony's autobiography is, you know, Too Much Too Soon is what he calls it. And he kind of came in with this incredible body. You know, he was a bodybuilder turned wrestler. And came in with this amazing physique and was given a lot of opportunities out of the gate. And again, he just kind of had this emotional volatility. It, of course, you know, it's like sort of obligatory mention of, you know, his shoe fetish, which, you know, is actually according to Tony, like a bigger, it played a bigger part into his career trajectory than I would have thought. You know, he talks about, you know, for those who don't know, I mean, Tony, you know, likes to be walked on quite often by women wearing, platform shoes.
Not promoters. Promoters can't walk on it, but the women wearing the big shoes.
Yeah, I've seen it firsthand before, many times.
Or first foot.
First foot, exactly. Excuse me. But it's something as he says in the episode, like, he would no-show events out of the temptation of an opportunity to get walked on, and that was sort of his happy place, his place of, that's how he de-stresses, and so that played a big part into him missing a lot of opportunities, according to himself.
Well, and also for people who might not be familiar because they see his body, but they think, oh, Superstar Graham and those other bodybuilders at the time, they, were California and they're on Muscle Beach. Tony White is his real name, and he grew up outside of Roanoke, Virginia, in a little small town and dirt poor. And he managed to build that body and that reputation and start winning the, teenage, contests with nothing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, genetically, obviously he was gifted, but just the work that he put into that. And that's what led the promoters to notice him.
Yep.
And he broke in there in the Carolinas of the 1970s. Everybody knows that was the place where every major NWA talent and every top in-ring worker and a blah, 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 they were flocking there.
Mm-hmm.
So he got in with, here's a guy, he's working with Ric Flair and Andre the Giant, people like this in his rookie year. He had a lot of people there to teach him. It was, I have some of the films and have seen, saw him early on. It was rough at the start, but he had an amazing athleticism for a guy that size.
Yeah.
But the point is, too much too soon. A guy that goes from, lifting paint cans on a broomstick or whatever, because he can't even afford barbells. And suddenly those guys on top of the Carolinas in the 70s were making a couple or $3,000 a week.
Exactly.
That's boom. Then that goes. And I'll pitch it back to you with this classic story. His rookie year, he's in the locker room in the Carolinas. And somebody looks over and sees Tony, and he's got a bottle of baby oil, and he's pouring the whole goddamn bottle of baby oil over all around his head, his neck, and his shoulders, his chest. And they said, "What are you doing?" And his accent like that, when he talked like that, because he's that Virginia, he said, "They tell me I got to shine tonight because old man Crockett's here."
Oh man.
So it was a learning experience there.
Right.
Very, very, a lot very soon, but go ahead.
Well, as you were saying, I mean, he came, from this upbringing, that he had, and, he was a fighter, having to, he got into a lot of fights as a kid, and he came from, not a great section of town, and, he had a lot to prove. And I think that coming from, his sort of socioeconomic background, and then coming into the wrestling business and making all of this money very quickly and not really knowing, how to save or, what he should do with it. I mean, he was just that money came in and went immediately out, and I think that's obviously he's not the only wrestler who had that sort of issue, but
right.
I think that was a big part of it. And, for him though, this episode definitely also gets into, he also struggled with addiction. And he had kind of a downward spiral, and his career, fizzled out, and he became homeless, and he was living on the street for periods of time. And then he met his wife, who basically essentially saved him, from living on the streets and brought him in and took care of him. Vince called him back and had brought him back as Saba Simba, and he had that experience of kind of seeing the bottom, And what's kind of heartwarming to see, and not to spoil it or anything, but his wife has suffered a stroke, I think, in the last few years, and he's been taking care of her like day in and day out. And so to see that just the relationship that they still have to this day is very moving. And so that's something people will see, which is cool.
Well, then an inspirational in some ways story like Tony Atlas. Then you go to the other side of the coin with. And he may be a blip on a lot of wrestling fans' screens, especially in America. They might remember him a bit in Japan. But the guy whose real name was Tony Halm, but
Mm-hmm.
they may know him as Ludvig Borga. You told me you were going to do an episode. I said, "What was he, a wrestler for 15 minutes?" I mean, I forgot that I had managed him. Remember that? You had to remind me I managed him the one, right?
Right.
And he was just the quiet guy sat in the corner with the weird look, and he had the, and I guess he was that generation's Gunther, except he couldn't work and he couldn't talk. But
Yeah.
Vince loved that, U-boat captain look. But now that you have done the episode and you told me some of the stuff that this guy was into away from wrestling,
Yeah.
this is just one of those ones. It's a heck of a story. This
It
guy
is.
he was shady in a number of areas.
Yeah. It is a wild story, and one that I can't believe we didn't do sooner. It's been one that a lot of people have recommended to me, and we would look into it and try and, I just can't believe we didn't pull the trigger on it sooner. But he basically, Ludvig Borga, I mean, I think he was in the WWF for a year, maybe at the most.
I think they probably signed him for a year, and that's when he left, when it was up.
Yeah, right. And so, fans might remember him. He does have a Hasbro action figure. I think it's one of the more valuable ones too, as a frame of reference. But basically,
most of the run ended up in a landfill, probably. So the ones remaining are very valuable.
Right, exactly. But yeah, he was booked as a Finnish heel, a heel from Finland, the Hellraiser from Helsinki. What you say in the episode, Vince will, if we don't have an issue with a country, Vince will find one, and
those goddamn Finns, they've stabbed us in the back again.
Right. But one of the big moments with him in the WWF behind the scenes is they all figured out that he had an SS tattoo. He had a Nazi SS tattoo on his calf. And that was quite alarming to a lot of folks. And I think it was, okay, we didn't know this. We didn't do the background check on him. And I think it was about
when they do the background check, does it include a list of your tattoos?
Yeah, a cavity search. Yeah,
but that's what I was trying to remember when we were talking about this last week. And then one of the listeners, goddamn, how old am I?
The readers.
One of the listeners sent a picture on Twitter. I was reading on Twitter, and it's what I was doing. And the listener sent the picture.
Right.
And it was, the SS lightning bolt thing with the eagle around it and everything, like you would see on Herman Goering or whatever.
Right.
And where is Finland in relation to Germany? I don't mean to derail your story, but
I don't know. It's somewhere around there, isn't it?
Somewhere in the area, I guess. Maybe,
Yeah.
But nevertheless, first they saw the tattoo and they're like, no, we got to cover that up.
Yep. And I think any kind of reason at that point to get rid of him, because he also was just very, he wasn't easy to get along with. He was confrontational, cantankerous. He didn't have a very good reputation among the boys. And then, so, I mean, for many, that's kind of where his story stops and starts, but for our episode, it was looking, we actually partnered up with a documentary crew in Finland who had done a story on Tony Halme over there, because he's a much more infamous person, obviously in his home country. Like he's everybody knows who he is, kind of thing.
And apparently they're not real warm on him either.
No, they're not. But there was a time where they were. So he comes from Finland. His sort of background is, he grew up as a very bitter and full of resentment kid, and joined gangs and, was kind of violent in the streets, beating people up sort of thing, very confrontational kind of guy. And he, you'll love this. His inspiration for wanting to come to America, the person that inspired him to want to be a celebrity was Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver. When he saw
are you talking to me?
Yeah, right, exactly. So he saw something in Taxi Driver that made him want to move to America. So he moved to America, went to the Gold's Gym sort of route and met people there and were like, hey, you'd be good for wrestling. You got the body and the whole thing. And so he actually wound up wrestling in Herb Abrams' UWF first, I believe. So he was the Viking for all the Herb Abrams fans out there. And then, he got WWF and all that. But when he was let go, he went back to Finland sort of in pursuit of, local stardom, and did a number of things. He became like one of they have like their whole equivalent to the American gladiators, and so he was a gladiator. And then he made his own, I think he recorded his own album. It's terrible.
Oh, good Lord.
Yeah, he was trying to become famous, and I think he wrote an autobiography, which most of it is like obviously fabricated, but he would say these very controversial, racist, divisive rhetoric stuff that he was starting to put out into the media and on television appearances, and it gained a lot of traction for being very controversial. And then there were politicians at the time who were part of, you could say, the sort of Nazi-ish party in Finland. There was a growing, anti-immigration sentiment going on in Finland, and they saw an opportunity to have someone.
Wait a minute. You mean all this shit's happened before in Finland? Go ahead. Yes. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the parallels are pretty uncanny, actually. That's one of the most illuminating things, is how prescient this story is. But anyway, and basically they brought him into politics as someone who would run for parliament, and he was with that sort of the sort of troublemaker party, and lo and behold, he won in a landslide victory. He's actually one of the most, I think he's still, looking back into like the Finnish electoral history, he's one of the people that's been voted for like the most out of anybody. Yeah. And so he came into power.
Mass hysteria gripped Finland, yes. And Ludvig Borga,
yes,
was elected to what was his title or office?
Parliament. Well, I don't know exactly how it works over there, but it's like
a parliamentarian
or whatever it is. But he yeah. And things didn't work out well for him. The hubris, the ego, out of control, drugs, trying to keep up the body. And everything. And then it obviously ends in a very grim ending for himself there. But it's a fascinating story. It's not so much a wrestling story, but it is, because, wrestling and politics are so linked in a lot of ways. And I think it's I think it's one of the more fascinating episodes we've done, actually. And just looking at, his trajectory after his career in wrestling and the parallels that are there. So, yeah, it's definitely one of the ones to not miss.
Well, and another one of the ones that I know that our listeners and, well, anybody who's followed this fellow's story over the last few years is not going to want to miss. We get all kinds of people always asking us about what's going on with Billy Jack Haynes. And now we're going to find out on TV on Vice with Dark Side of the Ring. Billy, and you've got a number of illuminating talking heads in this one, too.
Yeah, Billy Jack Haynes, man. It's funny, like when we started, I think maybe season 2 or 3, somewhere in there, we were always oddly compelled and fascinated by his shoot interviews, because they were so wildly crazy, and the things that he would, espouse, and the sort of conspiracies he would put out there, and just
confess to even.
Right. And putting himself at the center of certain things, and his look. Just, you can't ignore how he looked in those interviews, with the hair and the scars and everything. It was such a wild look. But I think it was, I'm trying to remember the chain of events, but I think it was when we were doing the Tales from the Territories show. We were doing a Portland episode, and we reached out to him to be a part of that. It didn't quite work out, but I believe at some point he reached out to us, I think after, the alleged homicide that's happened now, that people I'm sure are aware of, about him telling us, about him wanting to tell his story on our show. So it was this kind of wild thing where he came to us and wanting to talk for this show. So then that was obviously very compelling to us, given everything that's going on. But as we know, this has not gone to trial yet. So there is a limit to the things in that he can talk about specifically, but we were able to essentially arrange, or a interview with him behind bars, which was wild. So this is our first sort of prison interview that we've done on the show.
You knew when you got into the television business, it was going to take you places.
I guess that's a bucket list thing. I don't know, but it was fascinating. And, with Billy Jack Haynes
in the same month, you went to my house and prison.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It happened.
But that's the thing is that
sometimes I go from Vince Russo's living room to then your living room.
Now wait a minute. If you didn't tell me that, or I would have had a decontaminator here with the fog you down, for heaven's sake. Now
that's happened once or twice before.
From now on, I'm going to make you strip naked and put a hazmat suit on when you come in. But no, the question, the question here that everybody who had ever known Billy Jack or been around Billy Jack, just, way back in the day, or be even a fan of Billy Jack, watch him on TV, and then would see that gray-haired, beetle haircutted, Muppet-looking character it just be a raving batshit fucking crazy as a rainbow trout in a car wash.
Yeah.
Everybody, the question was, what the fuck happened to Billy Jack Haynes, and when did this take place? The accident, brain injury, safe fall on his head.
Yeah.
What insight were you able to derive from what the fuck happened to Billy Jack Haynes?
Well, one of the just difficult / frustrating aspects of his story is trying to get to the truth. There's so much of not knowing what's true. You go down one path, sort of, realizing, oh, this is a bunch of bullshit. It's a bunch of, this is totally untrue. And then you talk to somebody else that, no, actually he did have connections to the world of underground criminal activity, and there is someone who can speak factually about that, So it is, this episode does remind me in a lot of ways of our Marty Jannetty episode from season 4, in that I think, I don't know, this is maybe my personal opinion, but it's like for Billy Jack to kind of I think he also had a pretty quick rise to success, out of the gate.
Oh yeah.
And was put in that position. And I'm sure that was a difficult thing for him to walk away from, just in terms of that adulation, the spotlight, whatever, celebrity, whatever. And it
wasn't hard for him to walk out on a promoter, though.
That's true. Right. Of course. Yeah. But I think it's like that idea of still trying to remain relevant and still trying to insert yourself into the headlines and maintaining that. And I think for him, that is, something that he would do with his provocative interviews and the things he would come out and say, to get that attention. But yeah, I also think there's, a lot of people that we interviewed talk about his sort of manipulative side, that he had a kind of, he was very manipulative to a lot of people in terms of getting what he wanted and what he wanted people to do and say and think. And he could be a very violent person as well. So this episode is kind of our journey into trying to answer that question, and to try to figure out like what life events, what things have happened to shape this person into this unspeakable, unthinkable crime that has taken place. And to try to put that all together, but also separating fact from fiction, because so much of his story is unknown to a lot of people, even in the industry who knew him. Like what's true and what's not, so it is kind of, I would say it's similar to the Marty Jannetty story in that way.
Well, that's the 1985 Billy Jack. I can see being a guy who could talk you into things, and the look of him and the body and he had a tone to his voice, and, he could manipulate somebody to doing something. I can't see the 2020 version of Billy Jack Haynes being to talk somebody into spitting on the sidewalk.
Well, maybe not 2020, but when I can't remember what year, maybe it was 2018, I think, when he did come out with the Boys on the Track story, this.
Yeah. Did he ever give you any type of indication that even he knew, even if he was trying to make you believe something, that he knew that he comes off like a raving fucking lunatic? Is he aware of that and trying to just steamroller through it? Or does he think that people are looking at him like that he doesn't have steaming turds hanging out of his mouth?
Well, my point is, though, that the families of the victims of that Boys on the Track story, you know, for those who don't know, it was this story. I think it happened in I want to say it was the 80s. Yeah, it was the 80s, I think. When he was
West Memphis, Arkansas.
Exactly, where there was a drug deal that went wrong and these kids were biking by and they saw it, and then Billy Jack alleges that him and his accomplices tied them to the tracks and they were found dead on train tracks. And it was a big news story at the time. And but Billy Jack came out, I think in the late 2010s, with the story, like coming out, taking responsibility that I was there and I was part of this. It's tied to the Clintons, you know, it's tied.
Because the drug deal was supposedly orchestrated by Bill Clinton.
Oh yeah. He got phone calls directly from Bill, you know, kill the kids, you know, or whatever. I'm paraphrasing. But basically, yeah. So, but like he did insert himself with the real victims' families. So he was communicating with the victims' families and getting them to believe he was there and part of it.
And also, and wasn't his story why were you there? If this was some kind of drug deal, it was supposed to be done in the dark in West Memphis, Arkansas, on a train tracks. You're a television star. He said he was wearing a wrestling mask and he was there to shoot video.
Yep.
So they'd have proof in case anything went wrong or what. What the fuck? So nobody's going to notice this giant man in a fucking lucha mask with a camcorder attending this goddamn drug summit here. I'm sorry. I just get outraged at least come up with a good fucking story. But, and then wasn't there someone now with the modern research, the date that the murder happened, he was booked to wrestle in fucking Rhode Island or some shit?
I think so. Something like that. Yeah. So, yeah, but then like you hear that story, and then as preposterous as it sounds, right, which it is, but you then hear a story with photographic evidence of him getting involved in, you know, local mob types in Portland, you know, who had financed his. You remember when he tried to go up against Don Owens up there, his own promotion, and apparently the money from that was kind of sketch. And he was like beaten up like to like an inch of his life or something. And there's a journalist that's in the episode who talks about that and was also just fascinated by Billy Jack in terms of trying to separate fact from fiction. But here's these pictures of him, you know, being beaten in the hospital, you know, for his connection to organized crime. So it's like there is some connection that he has.
Well, maybe if he wouldn't go screaming from the rooftops every crook that he works for, they wouldn't keep beating him up.
I guess so.
He loose lips sink ships.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, another episode though, unfortunately the subject is not here to be a part of it, but one of the more interesting stories I think that hasn't been told on any type of television, the WWE programs obviously, but something that's long overdue, a look into Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert.
Yes.
And, you know, this is a guy who unfortunately gets no national television today in any of these retrospectives or documentaries because he was instrumental in a lot of places with a lot of talent behind the scenes and did a lot of great work, but was in a lot of cases in the wrong place, the wrong time for the eventual winners of all the promotional wars in the libraries that are out there now. And he didn't get to, you know, experience the attitude era that almost everything comes from. But a little bit about the Eddie Gilbert episode from your.
Yeah, definitely a passion project, you know, for our team, something we've always wanted to do. And I'm so glad we did. You know, Eddie Gilbert, one of the great minds of wrestling. And as you were saying, kind of sadly a forgotten figure to a lot of modern fans. And, you know, because he did kind of predate the internet age in a lot of ways. And he died kind of before, like the Monday Night Wars. Like, I kind of think like what he would have been like during, I don't know, like WCW Nitro or something, like what kind of role he might have played in that, maybe as a kind of wild Brian Pillman-esque sort of character or something.
Yeah.
So this is a big time what if story, I think, is what I would frame it. But yeah, he had a debilitating car accident early on in his career that he always suffered the repercussions of, the injuries he had from that. Coincidentally, was the same night as the Snuka Nancy Argentino situation, that car accident. Yeah, and so for him, it was kind of dealing with that pain, dealing with that kind of inherent paranoia that comes with the wrestling industry, being kind of a smaller size guy in a big man's world, and really his love of the business and his desire to really be the booker. I think that was always his dream, was to be somebody who was booking the matches and had a really forward-thinking mind for that. That sort of be the template for the future. Paul Heyman talks a lot about, Eddie being an early and, of course, ECW there and what an influence he had on him. And
Paul, in Paul's autobiography, did he mention Eddie's name? He said, a friend of mine asked me to, and that was boom.
There you go.
But, but if you catch him off camera when he can be honest, he owes a lot to Eddie. And Eddie was the first one to see Sting in Mid-South before he came to Crockett as a guy that they needed to feature. And you and I talked about for the episode that was the thing. Eddie wanted to be the booker. Eddie, he grew up, he idolized his father, Tommy, who was a fantastic worker. Not the flashy modern kind of baby face, but the Southern baby face that just everything he did looked good and made sense and he could sell and blah, blah, blah. But Eddie wanted to be his father. He wanted to be Jerry the King Lawler because that's the guy he grew up watching, and the promo style, because that was not Tommy's thing, was promos. And he wanted to be the booker because he was fascinated by it. And he had stood there and stared at Jerry Jarrett with moon eyes like we all did. Jerry Jarrett is the god of wrestling. and that's what drove him. But at the same time, whereas people think that I am a bit impetuous, or used to be at least back in the day, as far as telling somebody off or saying, fuck this or whatever. Eddie, I had a longer fuse than Eddie did. Eddie, if he would get in a sideways with somebody about something, generally about his booking or the booking or something related to business, and boom, he's gone. He was out of Memphis 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 times maybe, and back over a number of years. And I think that's what kept him, maybe if he'd lived to the Attitude Era. Oh yeah. He would not have been featured as a wrestler as much as maybe a Roddy Piper style player coach. Yep. And behind the scenes, he would have been in some type of producer or creative role if he could have existed by being a cog in the machine rather than because there wasn't the booker by the late 90s. Yeah. But that's where he would have, everybody would have been trying to draw on his he had a feel for the business because he'd watched it since he grew up and he understood it. It just sometimes he didn't understand how to be the businessman, even though he understood the business. Exactly. And I think it's all, and what's also fascinating, historically about him too, is that he sort of he did one of the first shoot interviews ever, kind of getting into the inner workings of the business, which I think came as somewhat of a surprise coming from someone like him who was so dedicated to, protecting wrestling and the secrets and so forth. But he did one of the first shoot interviews, which is very is interesting. Well, and I can tell you that because we talk about it in the episode. Eddie and I were the same age, a month apart in age, and I'd known him since we were 15 years old. And he, we were pen pals back in the day when people did that stuff. He'd send me, a picture or a letter. Hey, I'm working for Vince now, up in the WWF, whatever. But concurrently with what was going on the last couple of years of Eddie's life, me and Paul and Eddie were the same age, basically. Yep. and where I'd just been on the creative team in WCW, and now I'm doing Smoky Mountain, and Eddie has been booking and working in Memphis, and then he had just come off booking Continental, where he got Paul a spot. Also, they've both gone to Philadelphia, and Paul has stayed. Eddie's come back. Point is, we understood that there was a subculture of wrestling fans that were smart, and the epicenter was probably Philadelphia, and there might be 3 of them in Evansville, Indiana, or there might be 26 in fucking Indianapolis, but it was a small market, and there was an individual way to reach those people. Those early shoot interviews, Eddie decided to do it before I did.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, Eddie was campaigning at that point because he was kind of looking to be recognized, which that audience did.
Mm-hmm.
So that, somebody higher up on the food chain might say, well, let's give this guy a job. But it wasn't like in those days, it was a trickle theory. It wasn't like you were exposing the business to the outer world. You were exposing the business to the people that it was already exposed to.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
That were hungry to find out more, and they were the ones coming to, unfortunately, in Eddie's position in Philadelphia, that's the audience that was coming to his matches almost exclusively. So to reach that audience, you had to do something like that. Paul did it in different ways, and he was trying to hook into the grunge culture up there, which turns out there was more of them than there was the hardcore fans at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, doing the approach of, we're down here at a wrestling school, so you have to, in OVW in those years, the late 90s and the video era, you have to kind of acknowledge what's going on in wrestling because people know it's a wrestling school, but you create your own conflicts in that universe.
Mm-hmm.
Blah, blah, blah. But anyway.
That's spot on.
Yeah, who's on the Eddie episode?
The Eddie episode, I have that right here. Oh, well, you're in it.
Well, I mean, once you've got past the star of the show, but I mean, I have a supporting cast.
His brother Doug is in the episode, of course. Ricky Morton is in the episode. I think it might be the first time he's been on Dark Side, and he's fantastic.
I think you're right. Oh, Ricky is fucking hilarious.
Yeah, it's like, why hasn't he been on every episode before that? He's great. He was really good. We have a childhood friend, Darla Staggs, in there. Dutch Mantell is in the episode. Todd Gordon is in the episode. Medusa's in the episode, and I think that might be it.
And also, I knew Darla Staggs. We were pen pals.
Okay, cool.
Because she was part of the WFIA. I mean, we didn't write constantly. I mean, she was too sexy for me at that time. But but no, she was one of the 70s WFIA era fans. And Eddie, actually, I gave you some pictures that might make the cut of Eddie and Tommy being speaking at the WFIA convention when Tommy had gotten an award. Eddie was still a photographer. So this is kind of this all started, Eddie's story started in Memphis at the same time that I was growing up. We were on opposite ends of the territory. So a lot of this stuff it's nice to see getting a spot on television, childhood memories.
Yes. Yeah. It's good.
And there's another guy that I've been lobbying for a while. You did the Graham family, but the stories were so that tree branches all over the place. It's like a dogwood. The stories were so mixed and intertwined, and then went in separate directions that you focused on Eddie and Mike Graham and their side of the family. But now that's rectified. This season, superstar Billy Graham gets his own episode of Dark Side of the Ring.
That's right. And there was thought, when we did the Graham family episode in season 4, that we would try to, it seems like an absurd task now, but in hindsight, but trying to work in more of Billy Graham's story into that. But of course, him not being, as close to the Graham family sort of gimmick as much as the others were. But
and also on a timely, because again, You had to talk about Dr. Jerry and
Mm.
Eddie and
Hmm.
Mike, and their
Hmm.
family story was as interesting as the,
Yes.
the in-ring part of their lives. So, but Superstar Graham, because my God, at one time the biggest box office attraction in the business by virtue of being the WWF champion and selling out Madison Square Garden, like people were there to get a cure for the plague. They were beating the doors down.
Yep.
And then the dark side of that is that he went from the biggest star in the business to hiding in his house in depression
Yeah.
in like the space of 12 months. And then his career never recovered. Certainly everybody can agree on that. His legacy endured, but the rest of his in-ring wrestling career was at best and sad in some cases.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. This episode is, this is great. I'm really happy with how this episode's shaped up. It's very moving. It is, I would say, ostensibly mostly a family story, almost more than anything else. Of course, we interviewed his wife Valerie, his son Joey, and his daughter Capella, and yeah. I mean, tracking his career. Obviously, as you said, he was the original kind of superstar wrestler, the one that so many imitated, and he was such a blueprint for what would come next in a lot of ways. And the episode tracks, his origins, coming from the ministry, being a preacher, ripping phone books, bending steel bars, during,
Typical preacher.
typical preacher shit. Um, and really developing that promo style, during that, of course, obviously taking the name Billy Graham, which from the real Billy Graham. But for him, like the big moment is centering on getting the championship right from Vince Sr., having the belt, but knowing that the day was going to be coming where he had to drop it to Bob Backlund. And he thought that at some point, just by his own pure charisma, sheer will, that he could change Vince Sr.'s mind and see that we should be going this direction with, what I'm doing and as the champion in the company. And maybe we don't need to go with this Bob Backlund plan, And I think him not being able to prove himself in that way to Vince Sr., that he could be that person and should always be that person in that moment, and basically continuing to be the person who's drawing the houses and going to the next level. I think that was an extremely difficult thing for him to overcome. And that was sort of, as a lot of people in the episode talk about, the sort of beginning of the end with him in terms of the effect it had on him psychologically, whether that's from childhood in a relationship to his own father and, sort of trying to prove himself in that capacity. Because, there are voices in the episode like Steve Kern, who's like, kind of saying, well, it's just a belt, you're a mark, and don't lose sight of the money and, stuff like that. And for others, especially his family.
Well, but now, to be honest, the belt, if you got the belt, you get more money.
Exactly.
He had both. He had the
fair.
adulation. He had
Yes.
He was a hero in New York City. He was the first cool heel they'd really ever had. Maybe the Valiant Brothers, but they didn't get over like this.
Right.
And, he had everything. That's why people thought that Vince Sr. was nuts for taking the belt off of him. And at the time, and I always, in hindsight, looked at how in the world did they not somehow manage to switch him babyface at the same time and go with the flow? But when Vince wanted to keep up with his plan, and he had no idea that he was, employing this legendary figure. This was the guy he chose to be the heel transition champion.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And they were selling out everywhere anyway, but Superstar was selling out fucking everything.
Yep. Yeah, and of course, he it also tracks kind of, he went through so many medical issues. I think as a result of a lot of the steroid abuse that he had done to his body over the years.
Oh, and especially that era of steroids where they were mixing it
Yes.
up in the bathtub, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And just, going through that, and having a very sort of fractured relationship with his children and how their children, and basically like how his kids came to reckon with that, is very moving in the episode. There's one thing I didn't know that I had never seen before, but I guess at some point, I think in the 90s, Billy Graham put on this like stage production play that was this autobiographical theater production that is very abstract. Like I think it takes place all in a wrestling ring, but it's like the story of his life and like drug abuse and all this stuff. And Jake Roberts plays him in this theatrical production.
Oh, good Lord. Wait, what? Hold on. Back up. Pump the brakes.
Have you not seen this?
No, Jake Roberts plays superstar Billy Graham.
Well, I don't know if it's supposed to be like him exactly.
I
like
was going to say, is he hitting the double bicep? Jake?
No. I think he's just kind of playing an archetypal version of him.
Okay, so it's not like that. It's actually
no, it's not exact.
Appear like, I can't think of people who look less similar to each other.
No, but you see footage of it in the episode, and it's just like, wow, I had no idea that was a real thing.
Whew. But we are going to get to see the superstar Billy Graham story.
Yes,
on this season, and and that's the thing is he lost the belt to Backlund in what was it, February of '78? Am I remembering that right?
I think that sounds right.
And then he's out of the wrestling business for a while. Gorilla Monsoon reported him dead, and
yes,
he shows up in the Memphis territory in. I guess it was probably September, October-ish. Jarrett wanted to establish the CWA world title because everybody else was, being stingy with their world champions. And so to get a championship level star to carry the thing, I don't know. And I never thought to ask Jerry Jarrett now how the fuck he booked superstar Billy Graham or how that came to be. But here was the guy that was selling out Madison Square Garden, was one of the highest paid wrestlers in the world a year before that. And he's working in Memphis. And he had lost he looked like a 40-year-old ex-bodybuilder. And and he didn't have the history behind him. And he could still talk, but the people are like, because it's the first time they'd ever seen him in person. And he wasn't exactly busting his ass to, fucking get over like a young lion at that point. And it just didn't work as far as him selling any tickets. But I was thinking, how the fuck?
Yeah.
He couldn't even go back to work for Vern. He was a huge star for Vern in '72. But it was sad that between the depression and the substances and whatever, that, that was pretty much, by the time he got back to work for Vince, his body had betrayed him.
Yeah. And then when he came back to the WWF, he also had, the karate character, which is painful to see. I think his family too is like that. That was the hardest time to watch him, was during that period when he was in that character. Cause you could really see that like he's on pills during all that. And it's really tough.
Well, there's another one this season that's a tough story, and again, one that doesn't get any mention on national television these days or in any of the widely seen retrospectives. But she was well known for a variety of promotions for several years, and then unfortunately, her career kind of went the way of some. Daphne.
Yes.
And Daphne was out of wrestling, I guess sometime, I've lost track, sometime before her passing. But she was just, one of those girls that, I think, how big a turning point was it? The turning point was her injury from that goofy bump in TNA, and
right.
And it screwing up a variety of things in her body.
Well, I can't remember exactly what year the TNA spot was, but that definitely that injury was a huge part of her in terms of her like her downfall in a lot of ways, that injury. And she tried, I think, to sue the company at that time for what had happened, but they settled, which is just so shocking. They settled with her, and I think just gave her like 1,000 of her action figures as payment.
What the fuck? What?
Yeah. It's something I did not know. And it's just like, oh my God. So like, that's what she got as like her settlement out of that whole situation.
So, and it was, for the folks who don't know it, and I don't remember the specific details, but it was some kind of goofy furniture, weapons, no DQ match where she somehow got
Pushed
choke
off a ladder
slammed off a ladder through a table or some shit or other.
to the outside.
Yeah, to the floor, and fucked herself up in a variety of ways, and was trying to get TNA to pay for her medical bills.
Exactly.
At one point they said they would do, and then apparently forgot that they said that. And
and she had a garage full of action figures for it, which is just crazy. But she's I'm so glad we did this episode too. We got a lot of voices, from sort of the inner circle, if you will, the close friends and family of hers. They're obviously very protective of her and her legacy. And so for us to be able to tell that story with that sort of intimate access, I think is very powerful for this episode. And for her, it's tough because, she broke into the business. She was actually a child actor, which I didn't know either.
I didn't know that myself.
Yeah, she was a child actor. It blew my mind for all the cinephiles listening, that she was in.
Hey, we don't let those kind of people listen to the
show. She was in Nicholas Roeg's Insignificance, which is pretty amazing, which stars Gene Hackman, of course, R.I.P. But that just blew my mind. But she broke into the wrestling business and instantly developed a deep passion and love for it. And but she kind of broke in at this awkward time where, she broke in 2000, the WCW era. It's like women's wrestling was not what it is obviously today. It wasn't much of a thing. And so I feel like it was I think what's in part tragic about this episode is, she cared so much about the business and wanted to do so much with the business. But kind of reminds me of our Luna Vachon episode in a way too, where it's like, Luna also wanted to participate in doing more physicality and more things, but there wasn't that sort of role for someone like that.
Yeah.
And so I think she kind of got into this mode, especially with the TNA thing, where it was kind of doing, whatever is asked of you in that moment to do these things. And then looking at kind of what the ultimate cost of that is, if you know what I mean. So, yeah. So
and she was there. I worked with her some in TNA. I think this incident happened. I had already departed, as they say.
Right.
Stacy continued to stay in touch with her on social media. I don't know, Facebook, whatever the kids do. They would stayed in contact until her death, and Stace was broken up to hear about it. But she was definitely gung ho, and and the whole scream and the gimmick. She had personality,
definitely.
And, that's another one of those, I won't even go off on the soapbox about, but having girls, weapons, table, furniture, concrete matches. But she had personality. She didn't need all of that. She, had some oomph to her.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, as her story is, tragic in several ways, I think it does also spotlight her as a talent and really show what was special about her. And just you can just get this sense of her of like, what had there been more of an outlet at that time for a women's wrestler, like what she would have been able to do, so that is kind of difficult to see. It definitely, the episode does, look into, bipolar disorder and has, very honest conversations in terms of struggling with that. That was a big part of, her struggle in life. But I think it's a very moving tribute to her, and I think it's going to be one that a lot of people are going to be talking about after it airs.
Well, there's another one that, again, I think people are going to be talking about because even though there's been some highlights of him on Dark Side, mostly with the FMW episode and all that stuff, you are delving into the subject of exclusively the Sheik, a
Yes.
wild man from Syria, the noble Sheik.
Yep.
And just again for the footage and the pictures and the stories alone, I'm loving this. Anytime the Sheik can get on TV, we've seen enough of the rivalry between Stone Cold and the Undertaker on
Yeah.
Raw from 1999.
Right.
Give me some Sheik on national TV in 2025.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's been a great process putting this together, working with the family, but it is challenging in a lot of ways getting the real story of the Sheik, because as he was someone who held his cards so close to his chest, and the importance of kayfabe for him was at the utmost. And it kind of feels like in some ways his family is still trying to be very protective of who. Where do you draw the line between the Sheik and Ed Farhat? I know.
Yes. Oh, hey, since I've been doing this podcast, I've heard on social media, I think it was a few years ago, that his son, Captain Ed George, was offended that Jim Cornette and on his show said that the Sheik used razor blades.
There you go. Exactly.
But see, that's the great part of, because even in the wrestling business, most of the people in the wrestling business weren't sure about what the fuck was going on with the Sheik and the whole thing and the mythology.
Right.
Having different people tell the stories from different perspectives, and there's some grain of truth to every single one of them, even if they've been magnified.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the fun these days. Is this was the last guy that could kayfabe other people in the business.
Exactly. And, it was challenging to produce in many ways because a lot of his contemporaries have passed on. There's not a lot of people around from his, the height of his powers. But of course, we talked to, Sabu, who gives, I think is his best interview he ever has for us. I mean, it's a deeply personal interview. And he's also somebody that, you don't really get, I sort of feel like there's also a mystique about him. And he's very, I think, he goes very personal and he's very emotional about his uncle. And I think it kind of doubles in some ways, his story and his origins with wrestling are absolutely coming up through his uncle. And so I think that's really fascinating. Of course, Rob Van Dam is in it as well, too. He was trained by the Sheik. And I think that's kind of our modern day connection, to someone like him. But yeah, it's a fascinating look at the creation of this character, and the dedication that he had to his craft. And of course, it was something that was very difficult, I think, for him to let go of, when his time was quote unquote up, I mean, he pushed the envelope at a especially with what he did in FMW and WCW, well past his prime, shall we say.
Well, he was a superstar so late.
Yes.
Because
right.
he was a star in the 50s, but he didn't get to be a superstar until he got a hold of Detroit in the 60s and featured himself and had Toronto. Then he could his contemporaries, Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder and those guys, they had 10 years on him where they had been superstars when he's a star on TV.
Right.
And so 20 years later, he didn't want to give it up. But now, instead of being, a star for 20 years and he's 40, he's been a star for 20 years and he was 60.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, being that age and being in a wrestling ring surrounded by fire and his skin falling off, and it's crazy. It's absolutely nuts. But
there's such he had such drive to be himself and do what he did for so long, and we've made that one in Bruiser's territory right next door to it an example here on the show so many times of wrestling promotions that just aged out because
right.
the top guys were still the top guys.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And it was because nobody drew more money. And during the period of time Sheik was hot from 67 to 75, nobody, right. He was the top drawing box office attraction as a heel in the business. Nobody was drawing money like that. and he was spinning it as fast as he got it, but he
Yeah.
dressed the part, he looked the part. He went to Los Angeles and main evented the Olympic Auditorium so he could have his suits made.
Hmm.
The whole thing, it's an incredible story.
It is. It is. Yeah. I'm very excited for people to check that out. Definitely. And, but, there are, like I was saying, like, Brian Solomon put out that great book, about the Chic semi recently. And you can imagine sort of the challenges he had too, in terms of, separating fact from fiction, I guess, or trying to find the real story of the real person, Ed Farhat. And I do want to put it out there. I might as well. I mean, we always work on these episodes up until the very end. Like we're locking them the week before they air usually. So if anyone out there, any collectors have any, interviews with Ed Farhat that have been done over the years, man, we would love to get our hands on that if that exists.
Boy, howdy. That would be like the Lost Sea Scrolls, wouldn't it?
It would. I've heard rumor of a few, but I have not seen any of them. So,
but I'll tell you, my favorite Chic story, real quick, is that Chic and Dory Funk Sr. were very close. They'd had a business relationship going back, years and years, where Chic used to spend lengthy times in the West Texas territory, even after he owned Detroit, because he'd
right.
go in and work for Funk Sr. and he knew Dory Jr. and Terry. And so when the Chic's territory in the late 70s had fallen on hard times in Detroit, Dory and Terry came in and worked with Chic and Abdullah, this program with the blood and the violence to get the thing up. They were throwing everything out there they could, doing a boom. And finally, they draw a house one night in Nakobo. But it's not sold out, but it's not like the glory days. But it's at work. And Terry said he was sitting there going, "Junior, we're finally going to get a payoff for this thing." And that's when Captain Ed George, the Chic's son, ran in and said, "They've robbed the box office." Because as much money as Chic gave to down and out wrestlers when he was on top of the world, and he gave guys bookings and gave guys jobs and spent money like water, when the territory was down, the box office got robbed a time or two that year, I think.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And that's another thing. Captain George tried to deny having Terry told me that to my face, and it's been confirmed by, I won't mention, he still lives in Detroit. They might put a hit out on him up there, but a friend of mine. But nevertheless,
there you go. Yeah. Well, I should say that it's pretty exciting because we did interview Dory Funk Jr. for this, so he's in the episode, which is cool.
Excellent.
That was a good bucket list interview for sure.
And there's one more episode where he's kind of a modern day type of Chic. He was an Arabic affiliated character, but he didn't have the longevity or the success, and not because of his own lack of merits, but because he was the victim of one of the stupidest booking decisions in the history of professional wrestling.
Yeah.
Mohammed Hassan.
That's right. That's right. A more contemporary story, I guess. But yeah, man, this episode, I'm very much looking forward to the reaction of, because seeing it all laid out, it's obviously an episode that's been recommended to us many times on social media. Fans have wanted to see, Mark Capani, that's his real name, his story being told, because it's so fascinating, where he's cast in this role as a Italian guy, to play this, from a Middle Eastern descent, ostensibly a terrorist, portrayal, off the heels of 9/11. And it's just this powder keg of controversy that he walks into. But it's sort of this, again, it's this dichotomy where here's a chance for me to come out of developmental, with you and OVW, to getting the chance to go zip right to the main event scene, working with, Undertaker and Batista and like all these people.
Yeah.
And it's just an amazing trajectory, but at what cost? You have to play this extremely offensive character that is missing nuance and is offensive on many levels. by today's standards, something that, of course, they would never do. I mean, I think he's one of the only other, along with, I think, Chris Benoit, like you can't search for his matches on any of the WWE platforms, you know. They've pretty much erased that function for.
So they've equated him with a murderer.
Well, I don't know
because
that's the way to characterize it, but it's definitely something they want to, you know, they want to erase from their history.
Well, and that's you know, and I obviously I have contributed something to this episode. Hopefully, I've contributed. So I'm going to be on it, but hopefully, I've contributed.
I don't think you've ever been cut from an episode, Jim. So
but you know, I know it's coming. Then see,
yeah, right.
The odds.
It could be just you in most of these. But go ahead.
But like you said, Mark Capani's his real name, but he was in OVW. He came to one of our tryout seminars and it started, as far as I remember, from scratch in the OVW program and was in great shape, had a great body, great look. Italian guy from Rochester, I believe, or is it Syracuse?
I think it's Syracuse. I think you're right. I think it's
somewhere over there.
Yeah.
And just pleasant to work with and dedicated and rose through the ranks. And I've hopefully some of these worked the VHS tapes that I gave to you, to your fine researcher, Mr. Boucher.
Yes. Shout out.
Bobby Boucher that, but he progressed from like dark matches at the flea market show.
Yep.
To television, to being used in the top heel group, to being a top single with his own female valet and a gimmick with the leather pants and the wristbands, and he's gorgeous and he's tan.
Mark Magnus, right?
Mark Magnus. And he went from in like 18 months, he progressed that quickly and was doing a very good job of keeping up with whatever we threw at him. Mm-hmm. And then they gave him a developmental deal, and that's all well and good. And then, as I told you, they come and said, "Well, we want him to be an Arab." I said, "To what?" I said, "He's Italian."
Yeah, yeah.
And then we had to disrupt what he was doing, where he was doing so well, learning with all the guys he was working with, the coaches we had coming in. They take him off television. He still go to class, but now he's got to revamp his entire gimmick, and we at least had him as a sympathizer, because Sean Davari came in, and I love Sean Davari as a person. Again, the gimmick that they were doing here was not my favorite, but at least he's gone away because he had a losing streak, and now he's found a guy with a different ideology to tell him what's up, and also this guy's got a lot of money and he's financing this fucking arrogant heel who's also still from fucking New York State, right? But
yeah, right.
But now he's changed his name. Somebody changed their name to Muhammad in Louisville. People would get it. I said that, right? But then they just take him and they make him a goddamn villain from wherever the fuck.
Well, it was
kingdom of.
Well, no, it was the idea was somewhat interesting in that he was an American. Right. And it was in the wake of, 9/11 and the sort of Islamophobia that, he was him and his, family, friends were sort of were experiencing. In the wake of that, he was like, no, I am an American. And, he was pushing back on the stereotyping of him. But still.
Then where did he get the gang of hooded terrorists to come in the ring with him?
I'll explain.
Just a family man hanging out.
No. Because it started out that way. It started out as, I'm an American too, but obviously he was clearly being portrayed as a villain. There was no mistaking that this is still you're supposed to boo this guy, even though he's trying to come from a somewhat sympathetic. It's weird. There was a weird thing about it. More than one weird elements with the idea. But then I think as time went on, and that sort of aspect of the character, that origin of that character played out, they just crossed this threshold at one point, turned up the heat, and no, he's just a terrorist now. And he's anti-American, and he's, So But meanwhile, while all this is going on, there's so much pressure that the network, I believe UPN and others were threatening to drop the shows if they didn't immediately get rid of this character, because there was a lot of controversy where one of their matches coincided with, I think it was the London bombing.
The London bombing. No, it wasn't the match. It was where they held the Undertaker out. Right. We're going to try to behead him with the piano wire.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it was like the
well, why am I telling you? You just did the show.
Well, we're speaking to the people, but the London bombing had happened, I think, that day or the day before, and then they still aired the match. And they put this little chyron below, trying to cover their tracks and saying how if people were, offended by this,
the beheading of,
but it was crazy.
The Undertaker, does not reflect the views.
Yes, or whatever it was. But it was crazy, and it's one of those times where then what they did is in response was, all right, we're gonna kind of throw him under the bus for this. And get rid of him as a character. And it's wild going back and seeing the footage. He was in a match with the Undertaker, I think one of the last matches they did, and they literally power bombed him through the entranceway onto the concrete and made it look like he just died. Like, well, he just killed him, so that's it. And then the character was never seen again. So it's this wild trajectory where he kind of was thrown under the bus for all of this. They never repurposed him. They couldn't repurpose him. So the whole this whole trajectory for him is tragic in a way, because he kind of is the ultimate fall guy for this, but it's also the Faustian bargain that you take, when you're going to fast track your way to success at the top, playing in a main event role, but at what cost? What are you signing up for? This crazy freaking thing that's, going to upset so many people and rile up so many people, and also be this heat seeker of a thing. And he talks about a lot of the experiences he had out of the ring, where it was insisted that he wear, a turban and he wear these things out of the ring. And there were a lot of people who were not happy about that. And he also did kind of get to experience prejudice, as well too, which is also fascinating and just weird, So,
well, and that's, I've said it that since now he's a grown, successful adult with a real job in school, helping the young, contributing to society, he probably did better in the long run than if he'd have been stuck in the wrestling business. But he may be the best wrestler whose career only lasted 2.5 years.
Yeah, maybe so. And he does say that he is thankful he went through all this craziness with the character, because it led him to the path of being able to, work with kids in schools and be a vice principal and, do all that stuff. So, but it's a fascinating story. Again, one that people have wanted us to do for so long. And then when you see it, you're like, wow, why did it take us this long to do this? This is a good one, so.
Well, speaking of vice principal, you are the principal part of the Vice TV lineup, because Dark Side of the Ring is the #1 show on the network, and we're going to try to keep it that way for season 6, which begins on Tuesday, March 25th at 10 p.m. Eastern, and figure it out if you don't live in Eastern. And Evan, thank you for being here. Tell Jason we said hello. Thanks. And can't wait to do something for season 7.
Yeah. Oh my God. All right.
Yeah, we'll see. You got plenty of free time, right?
Yeah, right.
Let's start on season 7. Right on. Let's do 20 next time.
Oh my God. They'd probably want it for sure.
All right. Evan Husney, everybody, and we will be right back.